Hope you like this. If you do, give it a thumbs up and leave any comments below. And remember to subscribe to the channel to be kept up to date on all my hypnotic bedtime stories. So I hope you enjoy the story. So as you listen to me and continue to drift into a comfortable sleep, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster with the sound of my voice, or whether it'll be with the words that I use, or whether you'll drift asleep faster with the spaces between my words. And as you begin to comfortably fall asleep, I'll tell you a story in the background. And it's a story about a woman who has recently moved into her brand new house. And she had saved for years and years and years for a deposit for her own house. And she was excited now that she's finally living in her new house. And after weeks of organising things and putting in furniture, and taking everything out of boxes and putting it all in the right place, finally she gets to look around her house and see it completed and done just as she imagined in her mind it would look. And she walked from room to room, admiring that this is her new house, seeing how she's laid things out, where she's put things. Then she walked through the kitchen and out into the garden. And for the first time in her new house, she felt she had time to stop and relax. And she sat down on a chair in the garden to begin to take some time to relax, following all this hard work she'd put in. And she sat on this chair and had a drink beside her, and had a book, and she started reading that book. And while she was reading the book, she could hear birds in the background. She could feel the breeze on her face, see the way the trees at the end of the garden were swaying in the breeze. And she hadn't really done anything to the garden yet, but the previous owners had looked after the garden. And after a while of sitting there reading, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, she decided to have a little wander around the garden, a little explore. She'd never really explored this garden yet, hadn't had time. So she walked down the garden, taking in the smells of the flowers in the flower bed. Walked all the way to the trees at the back of the garden. And she knew that her garden extended on for some way into the trees. So she walked through the trees. She wanted to know what the view was like over the back of the garden. So she walked through the trees and went and took a look at the view. And at the back of the garden was undulating fields and countryside and some woodland. And she turned back into her garden again. and she saw what looked like a stone wall. Just a slight little bit of ruins of a stone wall. And she thought this was curious, and so she went and took a look. And she explored this stone wall. And she stood facing at the end of the stone wall in the direction it was pointing to try and see if she could see whether there was any other bits of stone wall. And she saw through the trees that there was, and so she walked there. And she started discovering that there was obviously some kind of a property, some kind of a building here that's now just ruins. And she started walking around and trying to mark out the boundaries of this property, work out how one wall connects to another bit of ruin, and that connects to another bit. And then she started looking at it and trying to work out what kind of ruins was this? What's the age of this? And she found this intriguing and exciting, having ruins in your own back garden. She didn't know if they were old ruins, or ruins from perhaps just 20 years ago. And she was curious to try to find out. And once she'd marked out all the bits of the ruins and worked out roughly where the walls were for this building, she started looking within those walls to see if there was anything of interest, any clues. And she thought that this can't be too recent because there were trees in the middle of the ruins as well as outside the ruins, and the trees looked about as old as each other. So the ruins had to be older than the trees. And she started exploring in the centre of those ruins. And she was down on her hands and knees, brushing away at the ground with her hands, having a look for anything she could find. And after a little while of searching, she found an area that looked like stones or bricks or some kind of masonry near the middle of the building. And so she started uncovering that. She went back towards the house and went to the shed, and she got herself a little trowel. And she came back and she started excitingly uncovering that bit of masonry, that bit of whatever it was that was built long ago. And mud had got inside it and around it. So she carefully started digging that all out, and digging from around it all, and just scraping it away. And then as she was clearing out the centre of it, just very, very carefully, little bit at a time, she found what looked like an ornate egg, a slightly oversized ornate egg. And it was all muddy, and so she carefully with her fingertips started clearing off the mud. And as she cleared off the mud, so she noticed that it seemed like it had gold on it, and it had some purple on it, and it had some white on it. And it was actually in very good condition, and yet it looked very old. And once she'd got that out of there, she decided to go back down the garden, back to that chair. And she went back to the chair and started looking at the egg. And she tried to search, see if she could figure out what it was. And she looked really closely at it, looked at the top and the bottom. She felt the weight of it moving up and down in her hand. She shook it gently to see if it sounded like there was anything inside it. And as she shook it, so she noticed it did sound like there was something inside it. So she thought there must be a way of opening this egg. And she obviously didn't want to damage it. So she carefully looked at the outside of the egg, at all the different detail, trying to find something about this egg that would give her some kind of a clue as to how to open it. She couldn't see any way into the egg, so she was reasonably confident it wasn't just a bit of mud has got in there, and that the shaking, that you can hear the sound, is a bit of mud. She was sure it must be something in there on purpose. And as she pressed gently around the different points around the outside of the egg, so suddenly the egg popped open, and she could see this rolled up piece of paper. And she looked on that rolled up piece of paper. And saw that it spoke about a specific stone feature. And it had a drawing of that stone feature. And it was an upright feature, and it was surrounded by a stone circle, a circle made of over a dozen stones. And there was a picture of that. And there was a picture to show and some writing that seemed to point that there was something there. And she couldn't really understand the writing, but she could tell that it seemed to be linked to kind of saying that there's something in this stone circle. And she didn't know where this was. She didn't know if it was nearby or if it was halfway around the world. But she hoped that it would be somewhere nearby, that the reason this was in this ruins is that it had some relevance to this area where she's moved to live. And so she started looking at different maps, different pictures, started searching on the internet, trying to find pictures of the area, pictures of her new house, pictures of the surrounding countryside. And as she looked at different pictures, she found something really intriguing. That there had been a summer that was incredibly dry. And one of the pictures taken during that summer showed this partial circle near some woodland, with about 2/3 of the circle in the field and the other third somehow into the woodland. And it was just the way that, because it had been a very dry year that year, that the grass with the different soil beneath it had been able to grow differently. Some of it had more moisture in the soil than others. And this was just over a far corner of one of the fields that she could see out the back of her property. So she went all the way through her back garden, through the trees, climbed over the fence at the back of the garden into the fields, and started walking through the fields towards that location. And she couldn't find any information to say that any digs have taken place around here. So she was really curious to know whether this was something new, and she was excited. And she could hear the way the ground crunched under her feet as she walked all the way over the fields, those undulating fields. And she walked all the way to that far corner of the field, and she couldn't see the circle now, but she knew roughly where it was. And so she looked at the image of that area and tried to work out roughly where she was in relation to that image. And she found her way to where the centre of that circle should be. And using her trowel, she dug down a little bit into that field. And she dug in a few different places, and she noticed that some areas were very stony and the ground that you would expect. And other areas were a different type of soil, as if a gap had been filled in. And she assumed that maybe that location was where there was once something stood up in the middle of that circle, stuck deep into the ground. And so she dug down into that circle, into that location. And after some time of digging, she found a chest. And she pulled that chest up, opened it up, and started reading. And she didn't really understand what the words were that she was saying. She just tried to read the words, trying to figure out what language this was, what it all meant. And as she was trying to read the words, so she felt herself going inside her mind. She felt herself drifting and becoming more calm and meditative. And her eyes began to close. And then it felt like her eyes opened again, only this time she was in a different time, a different location. It still looked like the circle, only the stones were in place. All the trees weren't there, and there were different buildings. And it looked like perhaps 1,000 years earlier. And she didn't know if this was some kind of a dream, and she stood up, started looking around her. And then she saw in the distance a building with some smoke rising from it. And she felt this compelling feeling to head towards that building. And so she walked across the countryside towards that building. And as she got closer, she noticed it looked like some kind of a temple, with smoke rising up from the middle, up through the top of the temple. And she found her way all the way to the temple, and there wasn't many people around in the area. And as she walked into the temple, someone greeted her and started talking to her, and she was surprised that she could understand them, and she responded, and they seemed to be able to understand her. And she asked where this place was, and they named it something she was unfamiliar with. She asked when this place was, and they gave a date that she was unfamiliar with. She asked how she's there, and they said that she must have read that scroll. She must have read the text that sends you through time and space, and that connects you with a part of your destiny you didn't even know you had. And she was curious and didn't understand what all this meant. And they told her that if she's here for a reason. She's here because, perhaps in her time, she's the one that's right and chosen through fate to know this piece of knowledge. And she wondered what piece of knowledge. And they told her that to know the knowledge, she has to demonstrate her courage. She has to climb the ladder in the middle of the building. And she didn't have a problem with heights and thought, well, I'm happy to climb the ladder. And she looked at where the ladder was, and the ladder was going up right where the smoke was going up. And they said that she'll have to climb that ladder to the top. And to do so means climbing up in the smoke. So you're going to have to do it with your eyes closed and while holding your breath. And she now felt this was a bit more of a challenge. But she really wanted to discover what happened next. And she thought to herself, well, this is probably just in my mind, so it's not like there's any risk. And as she thought that, something fell on her foot, and the person smiled at her, while she acknowledged the pain. And they said, this is as real as any other real life. And so she realized, this means she does have to be courageous if she wants this. And realize that anything you work for can often be hard work. And so she took a deep breath, started walking towards the ladder, and just before entering the column of smoke, she closed her eyes, felt the ladder under her hands, moved her foot forward and stepped on the first rung and felt for it with her foot. And and then moved one hand and then the other hand up, and then stepped the other foot onto a rung. And then in her mind's eye she pictured the ladder as she held her breath and remained calm and relaxed. And she lifted up a foot, feeling the rungs, placed the foot on a rung, and then lifted up the other foot, feeling the rungs, placed it on a rung, and moved her hands up and gradually climbed her way up to the top. And when she reached the top, she could feel the air on her face, and she knew that she had passed the top of the temple. She opened her eyes and could see the smoke being blown away by the air just beneath where her head was, and she stepped out onto the top, onto this rooftop, and took a deep breath of fresh, clean air, and sat down just a moment, just to centre herself. And then she saw that there was a chest on this rooftop, and the person who was down below was now up above, sitting near that chest, smiling at her. They gestured to the chest. She went over to the chest, opened it up, and saw this ancient text. She looked at that ancient text and realized it was written in readable language, and she was curious by this. And the person told her, you see what you want to see and what you need to see. It changes to be what you need when you need it. And she read the text and started learning about connecting with nature, valuing nature, and some other important bits and pieces about how to remain calm, how to deal with challenges and adversity, and how to positively impact on those around you in a way that makes them then positively impact on those around them, and so it spreads. And she sat on this rooftop, learning all this knowledge. And after learning all this knowledge, when the person felt it was right for them, and that they knew the knowledge, the two of them found themselves at the entrance. She didn't know how she got there. It was almost like she just moved her eyes, or blinked, and yet she was then suddenly in a different place. And they told her that she now knows what she needs to know, and it's time to go back to her time. And as she was told that, her eyes began to open, and she found herself sat in that field with a hole in the ground. She put the chest back into the ground, covered it all over again. And with new knowledge, new wisdom, new insights, she went back to her garden, sat down in her garden, processing those insights and learnings, and the difference it'll make to her life in easy and effortless, automatic ways. and she could smell a bit of smoke on her, and so she realised perhaps it wasn't just a dream. And then that night, she settled down for the first proper night, where everything was organised and in place in her house, and drifted comfortably and relaxed asleep.